talk about Cyprian and the rebaptism controversy. Let me just say by way of introduction that there are in some contexts a rebaptism controversy now, but it's a different kind of thing. In the modern period, there are some churches and some denominations that believe in a certain form of baptism as being proper. So if this happens in churches that believe that full immersion of a believer is the only proper baptism, and so if someone joins their church from a tradition where they were sprinkled as an infant, for example, they may have them baptized again because they think the first form didn't count. That's not what we're talking about in this period. It's not a theological debate over the form of baptism. This has to do with the baptizer. Who is performing the baptism is the problem in the rebaptism controversy. So Cyprian is in the middle of this. The controversy over rebaptism during Cyprian's life also comes out of this debate about the lapsed. So this controversy about the lapsed eventually spins off into another related controversy. Now, in the previous lecture, I mentioned a guy named Novatian. Novatian was a figure in Rome who, after the death of one of the bishops, he steps in I guess you could say the bishop, the interim bishop, but then is not elected the full bishop, but still kind of stays around Rome and causes problems for the other bishop. So this figure, Novatian, represented a very rigorous position. This is one of the cases in which a Roman figure is probably the most rigorous of all. And what Novatian was saying in Rome was he actually splits off, in some people's perspective, he splits off from the church at Rome because he thought the Roman church was being too forgiving about the lapsed. So Novatian's important to have on our radar in that we said in the last lecture that generally the African church ends up being more rigorous than Rome. Novatian is a figure in Rome who is very, very rigorous. And because he's so rigorous, he's rejected by the church at Rome. Just gives us an idea of the controversies. The bishops of Rome, they're going to have some conflict with Cyprian, and they have conflict with someone within their own church who is more rigorous. This figure named Novatian. Now, Cyprian and Novatian and the bishop in Rome, the different bishops, because they die in fairly quick succession in the 250s, they all have some issues in common, and one of them has to do with baptism. So, Novatian is a figure in Rome who is operating as kind of an alternative bishop, and he's baptizing people. Well, if someone who's been in the church of Novatian comes to North Africa, does the baptism count? Does the baptism count? If Novatian baptized someone who's not officially recognized by the church as the bishop, if he performed the baptism, does it count? Or it could take other forms. If a person is a Montanist, if they're baptized by a Montanist bishop, and Montanists in some cases were considered schismatics, does that baptism count or not? It's not about the form of baptism, it's about the person who does the baptism. So, does the baptizer have to be pure for the baptism to count? So the last lecture we talked about the church being pure. Now we're focusing specifically on especially the bishops or priests or other people who are performing baptism. Do they have to be pure for it to count? Another way to say it is does baptism do its work because it's baptism? Or does the right person have to do it for it to work, for it to count, for it to be, as we say, efficacious, for it to count, for it to do what it needs to do? And Cyprian actually takes a more rigorous position. Cyprian says, if people come to our church who were baptized by schismatics, by people like Novatian, we're going to rebaptize them. Because that earlier so-called baptism doesn't count. Not because of the form, but because someone who is not a proper agent of the church cannot perform a proper baptism. So if a person came from Rome and they had been baptized by Novatian, Cyprian said we have to rebaptize them. If someone came from Western Turkey, from Asia Minor, who had been in the Montanist church, Cyprian may or may not feel the need to rebaptize them, depending on how he felt about that particular bishop. So Cyprian takes a more rigorous position. So let's keep in mind now, we have Cyprian taking the rigorous position that you have to rebaptize. Novatian in Rome took a rigorous position about the lapsed. And he came into conflict with the Roman Church. It won't surprise us to learn then that Cyprian comes into conflict with Rome also on the issue of rebaptism. Because Cyprian says we have to rebaptize those who were baptized by schismatics. He takes the rigorous position. The Bishop of Rome, however, does not. The Bishop of Rome does not. The Bishop of Rome does not agree with Cyprian on rebaptism. And in particular, the Bishop Stephen of Rome. Now, we saw Stephen a number of lectures ago. We were talking about the rise of the papacy. And I mentioned an occasion on which 2 Spanish bishops had been removed from office, had appealed to Rome, been put back in office, and then people in Spain wrote to Cyprian to ask him to reverse the decision of the Bishop of Rome. And it seems that Cyprian does reverse the decision of the Bishop of Rome. That bishop was Stephen. So Stephen and Cyprian have already had a little bit of conflict over the case of these 2 bishops in Spain, whether they should be kicked out of office or not. So Cyprian and Stephen already have some tension. Stephen says that God ultimately does the baptism, that God is the baptizer. So if a baptism is done in the name of the Trinity, it counts. So what counts is the way you perform the ritual. If you baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, it doesn't matter who does it. It counts. Now, we can pause for a second, and one of the issues that comes up in other places is whether, for example, women can baptize. And there's a text, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, a 2nd century text, in which Thecla is in the arena. She's about to be killed, or she thinks she's about to be killed. And so she decides she hasn't been baptized. She wants to baptize herself. And so she decides to jump into a big tub of water to baptize herself. And a commentator writing not too long after that says, the person who wrote that text was defrocked. He lost his position in the church because he was arguing that women could baptize. So this dramatic scene of Thecla baptizing herself was seen as justification for women baptizing. And people were so against the idea that women could baptize that the person who wrote the story lost his position in the church. So the idea there was women can't baptize, so only certain people can baptize. In that case, men. Stephen comes back and says, well, it doesn't matter who baptizes. Now, this does not mean that women are baptizing in Rome, but it means that by this logic, women could be baptizing in Rome. If the logic is that God baptizes, and what's important is the name of the Trinity, then logically anybody could perform a baptism. But they're not thinking about male-female. They're thinking about proper bishop schismatics. So the Roman view, which it won't probably surprise you to learn, becomes the official view of the Western Church, is that the faith of the presider does not affect baptism. If it's done the right way, it's efficient, it's efficacious, it works, it's accepted by God if it's done in the right form. The faith of the presider does not affect baptism. Now, they're not thinking about this, but if we push this to its logical conclusion, this means that a non-Christian could perform a baptism. And that's if baptism is ultimately performed by God, then hypothetically, if the faith of the person presiding doesn't really matter, then hypothetically a non-believer could baptize someone. That's a strange situation. I can't imagine in what circumstances that would happen. But notice the position very clearly. The person doing it is really God is the one doing it. God is doing the baptism. The person who's actually there physically really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's doing it. Cyprian flatly rejects this perspective from Stephen. He disagrees with Stephen. And he represents what seems to be the dominant majority North African view. The grace of baptism flows through the baptizer, through the person presiding over the baptism. So the presider has to be pure. The one doing the baptism has to be pure. The grace of God at baptism does not come directly from God into the person being baptized. The grace of God comes from God through the person presiding over the baptism to the person being baptized. So if the person doing the baptism is impure, I'll just go right up here. Thus, if the person doing the baptizing or the Eucharist or whatever, if that person is impure, then what they're doing is impure. Here we're talking about baptism, but it also applies to the Eucharist. It would apply to anything. The grace of God is given through the person doing these things. So a person who is a heretical bishop or a schismatic bishop cannot preside over the Eucharist because that person is impure. They cannot preside over baptism because they're impure. This, by the way, is one of the debates, or an element of the debate in especially the Western Church over the ordination of homosexuals. There's a question about sexual ethics in general, but for other people the conversation has been, if the bishop or the priest presiding over the Eucharist is considered sexually impure, is the Eucharist count? Right? Does it carry the grace of God? If the person who is the priest in the local church or the bishop has an impure lifestyle and they baptize your child, does that child receive the grace of God? And some people say it doesn't matter who does it. Other people say, no, we have to have certain standards. This debate in different forms, or the idea of the purity of the bishop or the purity of the priest, is still around. It's still a debate. It comes up in different forms now, but it's still out there. So Cyprian thinks the Roman position is too lenient. Saying that schismatic baptisms count is too lenient. Baptism by a schismatic, like novation, does not count, which means that Stephen in Rome would be accepting people from Novation's church. Novation is challenging him in Rome, and if someone leaves Novation's church and comes to Stephen's church, Stephen welcomes them without rebaptizing. But if they go to Africa, they have to be rebaptized by Cyprian. So here we have this debate. And earlier on we talked about the fact that in the early centuries, we don't have evidence, we have a lot of evidence to the contrary, that the Roman bishop controlled everything and that what he said went. Here again, the Roman bishop says this is what we think is the right position, and the African bishop says no thank you. No thank you. We don't agree. So it doesn't appear, even if the Roman bishop may have thought he had the authority to tell Africa what to do, apparently Cyprian and the African church does not agree. This is not a Roman bishop who can tell everyone else what to do. So we come back again to our question. What's the church? Is it a clean room? Or is it a hospital? Or let me turn the question a little bit this way. If you go to the hospital, if the doctor is sick, can he make you well? If the doctor is sick, can he make you well? That's really more the question here. It's not about pure, impure of the people in the church. It's about the doctor at the hospital. If you go to the hospital and the doctor has a cold, can he make you well? You may not want him near you, right? But Or if you go, if you have a doctor who maybe has some kind of sports injury, right? She pulled her hamstring running a marathon, and you go to her for surgery. Can a doctor with a pulled hamstring, can she perform brain surgery on you? Does the health of the doctor determine whether you can be made well or not? Does the health of the bishop determine, does the health of the priest determine whether or not the grace of God flows through the Eucharist and through baptism or not? So this rebaptism controversy signals issues that are going to come back again in Africa. It's slightly different form, but the issues are going to be the same. If you know anything about the Donatist controversy and you're thinking, this sounds like the Donatist controversy, it sounds exactly like the Donatist controversy. Because the Donatist controversy flows directly out of these events in the middle of the 3rd century. So, how do you deal with the lapsed? Right? These are questions we've seen in the last couple of lessons. How do you deal with the lapsed? People who have fallen away. Do you let them back in the church? Are they out of the church? Do you let them back in after a while? And what happens to the effectiveness of a bishop who is considered impure in some sense? If a bishop falls in the midst of persecution, is that bishop out forever? Can that bishop be restored? Can that bishop perform the Eucharist? Can that bishop perform baptisms? Or, as we'll see with the Donatist controversy, can that bishop ordain other bishops or not? Do they lose all of their authority as bishops if they fall in some sense or not? And who decides the answers to these questions? Who decides the answers to these questions? Does Rome decide? It seems that for Cyprian, Rome does not decide. Or does someone else decide? Does the Bishop of Carthage decide? It's clear that when Cyprian said, this is my position, it doesn't mean that everyone in Carthage all of a sudden said, oh, of course, we all accept that. Cyprian still had to deal with dissension within his own congregation. So on these questions, who decides? Did the confessors decide? Did the confessors get to say, we're going to allow the lapsed back into the church? Cyprian seems to say, no, it's the bishop. But the confessors seem to disagree with him. So we have a, you could say, a symptom. People who are lapsed, rebaptism, these are symptoms of larger questions the church is dealing with about authority and the nature of authority and the nature of the church. And circumstances are putting the church in a position of having to specify things they haven't specified before, or maybe answer questions they haven't thought about before, or look at contexts they haven't encountered before. It's pushing the church into new situations. And as this happens, bishops like Cyprian are doing their best. Well, based upon what we know before, I think this is the way we should be going. But they're not making it up as they go along. But in some sense, they are to an extent. I never thought about it. We've never had this situation before. And there's conversation and conflict over these things. So the time that Cyprian was a bishop in Carthage was not an easy time. Was not an easy time for Christians. Wasn't an easy time for him. Was not an easy time for the relationship between the church in Carthage and the church in Rome. It wasn't an easy time for the people in his church because they're also dealing with these things. So questions about Cyprian on rebaptism, or even maybe backtracking if you want to anything else about Cyprian, and seeing this, the middle of the 3rd century here in Africa, as really a boiling point of some issues that we will see again. These issues do not go away. They come back, and when they come back, they stay a lot longer, as we're going to see. So questions about Cyprian. Yes?
The Church of Rome has a conflict with Cyprian, and it has a conflict as well with conviction.
Yes.
Which church had the authority here to decide and to prevent bishops to do their work?
So Rome has a conflict with Carthage, yes. and the Bishop Stephen has a conflict with Novatian. So who has the authority? The question: who has the authority to decide? Yes. Well, this gets a little bit tricky. And what we're going to see is, in the context of the Donatist controversy, when now Constantine is the emperor, the Bishop of Rome is going to say, Constantine, you decide. And Constantine's going to say, okay. And not surprisingly, Constantine is going to side with the bishop, the properly elected Bishop of Rome. But in this period, who decides? That's a very good question. It's a very good question. The Bishop of Rome obviously can't even tell people inside Rome what to do. There's someone inside Rome who's not listening to him. And apparently lots of people are going with this other guy. He certainly can't tell Cyprian what to do. He's not going to listen to Antioch or Alexandria or Jerusalem. He's not going to listen to them. So there's no ultimate court. There's no Supreme Court or ultimate judge to say this is what's going to happen. It's a matter of, a lot of it is a matter of conflict and trying to figure out ways to get the upper hand, figuring out ways to try to show that someone like Novatian is a schismatic and a heretic, and so if you go with him, you're outside Mother Church, you're outside salvation. Those are the kinds of things that happen, because there is no final court of appeal at this point. And both sides would be saying, well, God is, of course, the final judge, and God is on our side. Both sides, Novatian and Stephen, both think God is on their side. But we don't have any text that God comes down and says, oh, I figured this out, by the way, this is the decision. Right? God doesn't intervene in that way in this situation.